So land, I'm not going to spend any time talking about what land use planning is, except to say in general, in the tradition of the field, it's about the regulation and control of land, ostensibly for the good of society, and we can talk about that if we want to. But I do want to kind of focus a little bit on one aspect of this notion of land use planning, that's determining how people move through land. At any time when someone's, engaging with a physical space, be it, a city, a neighborhood, a college campus, a park, there's a question about how are people going to move through that space? And what's going to determine their movement? And there are actually kind of two, I want to bring out and talk about two different approaches. One is kind of framing this notion of desire lines, and the other one I call determined lines. And so a little bit about desired lines. So the notion of desired lines actually comes out of the early work of Jane Jacobs from her work in New York City, where she really kind of, advocated that, we should configure cities around this notion of desired lines. And she would say, something like that, there's no logic that can be superimposed on the city or a place or land, that people make it and it is to them. And it is to them what they must fit. It is to them that we must fit our plans. So her notion in that all of that is to say that we need to understand what people desire. And as we're trying to think about pathways and the ways people move through the city, let's build those around where people want to go. And it's interesting because in the desired space, really, people move through spaces for three things. Time efficiency, you can think about, to shape their experience, and often sometimes for resistance, right? Resistance to what has been structured before them that they want to, in some sense, kind of fight against. I'm going to, at some point here, share my screen. Just give me a second here. So kind of like one example of this notion is the work, when the University of Michigan built their new campus, one of the things that they did was actually not put any pathways in. They covered it all with grass. And then the idea is that they would, over time, see where people made pathways, and that's where they would then eventually begin to pave what the campus would look like. So this is an early map of actually the kind of human pathways that were made as people tried to make the connections that they thought made sense for them. And again, some of these were done for efficiency, some were done because people wanted to experience a different part, and some were done because people were resisting some things that were there. So that's one frame of really kind of thinking about this notion. The other is what I call the determined lines. And this is when there is no space, in some sense, for a person to actually create their own desired lines. Everything is shaped and predetermined for them. Probably one of the best examples of this is Cortino, the new story city that Disney is building, which is going to be a planned space and where every single aspect of the place is organized and designed for you to be in a particular story, right? So there is no way for you to have your desired line. What they are doing is shaping what it is you're supposed to desire, right? So both of these are planning issues, and I think both of them suffer from exactly the same problem of trying to. Sorry, I think both of these kind of excuse me. Both of these are really trying to do. Approaches are asking like, who gets to author the land, who determines what lines, what paths best serve us all. And neither approach is either collective or democratic. Both, I think in their own intensity are individualistic. Both are enmeshing systems of power and privilege and protection. And I think to break this cycle and kind of create more collective democratic processes, we need to figure out how we're going to bring people in all their complexity into kind of three practices, right? And the three practices that I try to work on that I think are essential for doing kind of collective democratic practices with people is one, how do we bring people into a space where they can share how they understand the world, right? Sometimes we call that framing. Another one is how do we bring them into a space where they can imagine what the world would be? And the third is how we bring them to a space where they can decide where they want to put their energy, right? So sometimes we can call these like they're framing things, prioritizing things, and framing things, ideating and prioritizing things. But these spaces, I think, the idea of kind of creating these kinds of spaces is really made difficult by the kind of complexity, both demographically and historically, of who we are as people, right? We don't have a practice, we don't have a model that kind of shows that for us. And so we're continually having to imagine it, right? We're having to kind of create it in our own minds. We have snippets and examples in which we can invite people into spaces or places that we say are more open to them and more open to everyone else. But we have very few examples where people can just draw on an image that says to them, this is what it means that I belong in this place and that anyone else who comes in this space belongs. And so we're asking people to do a heavy lift of trust to kind of step into spaces that supposedly are going to do that for them. So I think when we then think about this, I think our challenge and some of the things that some of you are working on is really kind of creating these kind of spaces and opportunities and where people can experience both their uniqueness and their interdependence, and where they can peacefully struggle with others around traditions that are binding them and interests that are separating them, so they can realize collectively a future that's an equitable improvement on the past, right? That's what we're trying to do, but creating that is really difficult. So I was going to spend just a few minutes telling you about one project that we had going on in Boston right now that is a little off, I wouldn't say off topic, it's just something we're doing in Boston that we tried to manage to kind of take on this task. So one thing when we're dealing with this issue of how complex our public is, it is actually impossible for any of us to kind of design anything that's going to effectively draw and pull attention to everyone, right? Where everyone feels this is where I belong. And so then the choice becomes, who do we do it for? And our framework in our center is that we actually design for folks at the margins, right? And our framing is that if you design something to work for the people who are most marginalized by something, the folks who are actually in the middle will find their ways into that space, right? And we have lots of evidence of that throughout the world. One of the simplest examples of that is hip hop, right? Which was an art form created within the context of a small community with a redefining of a technology where there's no place in the world you can go right now and not encounter it, right? It wasn't designed for the world. That wasn't its purpose. It was designed for something else, right? It was designed for a group who really saw themselves marginalized both by an industry, by a space of expression, by a set of things, and by creating something that was really for them. Others could find their way into it without them losing what it meant to them. And so that's, for me, one of the things that we try to hold as a core, that we can't design for everyone, but what we can do is design for those who are, have the least power in the world. So last year, Boston had one of its, had a very unique election in its history of existence. It was an election for the mayor, and all of the five candidates were women of color, which is phenomenal in the city of Boston. And so the question became, so, I don't know how much you pay attention to politics, but what happens in the politics, and particularly when you get down to the last set of candidates, everyone's trying to figure out how to identify and work with the people who are most likely to vote. And how do I get those people who, well, maybe they're not likely to vote, but if we just give them a little bit more, they will vote. That's where the energy goes. That's where the money goes. That's where the messaging goes, right? To connect with those folks. So we decided to launch a project in Boston that said, well, what about the people who don't vote, who aren't going to vote, who can't vote because they're in prison, they've been released from prison, the folks who are homeless on the streets, a whole set of folks who just, the aspect of connecting with the whole voting process just wasn't there, right? Those people who are kind of like marginalized that way. And how can we have them help shape what the agenda is? So we did this project. Let me pull this up again real quick. Oh, I lost it on my screen, but I think it tells me you can see it. Is that correct? You see something called Pure Boston? Okay, good. Oh, okay, here it is on my screen now. So we done this thing called Real Talk Boston. And the whole notion of it was creating these small conversations for folks who are really most marginalized from the voting process to do two things. Name a question they had about the future of Boston, their place in it, and tell the story of the experience in their life that got them to that question. That was it. And we would bring them together in small groups, and those were the kind of two prompts. And we had a way of getting people into it. All these conversations were basically done by people from the community who represented the group that was gathering at that point in time. So we did a few of them as training pieces, but other than that, it just kind of grew on its own. Every time someone did a conversation with 6 or 8 people, they would always ask at the end, do you want to learn how to do this with 6 or 8 people you know? And then they would teach them how to do it, and they would go do it. All these conversations were recorded. And then after recording, there's a process for, and I'll go through this in a minute, I want to talk about it, because what you're seeing here is the end product of that, right? Or at least one of the end products, which is a space where you can go now on this website by neighborhoods in Boston. You can actually go in here, you can actually hear a person's question. Hold on a second, you're not going to do that unless I share the sound, right? You can hear.
So I guess that's the question. It's like, will there truly be a dedication to the art scene and community and the uplift therein?
And then can you tell you the experience?
I asked this question because as a young person, kind of like navigating through like the artistic scene in the city, it's always been a difficult situation figuring out different ways to get my peers involved in different opportunities to receive funding for their art.
I'm just going to stop it right there for a minute, but there are lots of these, and there are all these combinations of people's questions and people's experiences. And then what we actually ended up doing, because this existed, this kind of insight into people who don't vote, a number of things started to happen. The Boston Globe started to run kind of articles on what people who aren't going to vote, who aren't likely to vote, have to say about the city and their experiences in it. We ended up running, after the candidates had shut down all their public forums, the last 2 candidates, they each did a forum that was based on them listening to the stories and the questions that people had here and really responding to how they were going to actually engage with that. Now, there's no tie to make them do it. But the point around this is really kind of 3 things. Trying to build something and connect something that would make it possible for people who are on the outside of something to begin to bring their experiences to the inside. That's one. The other is creating an enduring record of that, because so often when we engage with folks who are at the margins of society, our engagement around their narratives and their stories is really fleeting, and it can't be shared across different experiences. And so the idea here is not to have one group have an isolated set of things, but to actually build a kind of narrative conversation across the city from people who are in these positions. And it's really hard in Boston to get people from East Boston to talk to people in Mattapan, etc. But within the context of the system now, you have a way to go through and try to understand and hear and know the stories that are here. But the thing I want to share with you about this, I just want to show this pathway here, because for us, this is the really important thing, which is about not just having people having conversations, but having the people who have been in conversations to actually make sense of them, do the meaning making themselves, not to have external people interpret them, code them. And then even after doing that, actually having all the narratives and stories actually in a place that's controlled by the community. And so the community and the members who participated in here have the ability to decide what part of what they say becomes public and what part doesn't. And this is the kind of system that we're building, really this kind of control of one's own narrative and one's experiences into different worlds.